to a joint webinar today between the Iora Blue Carbon Hub and the International Partnership for Blue Carbon. At the Hub, we've run a few webinars ranging from sort of some of the blue economy issues all the way through to policy and science and livelihoods and various subjects. This is the first webinar that we've run with the International Partnership for Blue Carbon. And today's webinar will focus more on some of the international policy frameworks and what that means for you in your country. So a lineup of speakers who are experts on the subject that I'm looking forward to listening to today. The format of today's webinar will be that our four speakers will each give presentations that will last for around about an hour. And the idea is that then we'll have 30 minutes where you'll get an opportunity to ask a set of questions. Now, we would encourage you all the way through the presentations to post your questions in the Q&A. So the Q&A, if you are on a laptop computer like me, you'll find the Q&A button down the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, you'll have the opportunity to type your question in. If you're using a mobile device, it'll be somewhere else on your screen, although not having one in front of me right now, I can't point exactly where it is. Now, there is a chat function as well. Please don't use the chat function to ask the questions, but do feel free to use the chat function to introduce yourselves and just tell us who you are and what you're interested in during the webinar. So enough from me. You're not here to listen to me today. You're here to listen to our expert speakers. So I would like to introduce to you, first of all, David Pearson from the International Partnership for Blue Carbon. David is Communication Manager at the IPBC. He's based in Canberra, and then David will seamlessly transfer from Canberra over to Paris, where Elisabetta Bonotto, who's Project Coordinator at the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission and also a Project Coordinator at the IPBC, will take over and continue on. So enough from me. Over to you, David. Please feel free to share your screen and unmute and take it away.
Thanks very much, Matt. And just confirm that you've got my screen there, sharing that now.
I can see your screen and I can hear you, so we're all good.
Brilliant, we're all away. Thanks. So, hi everyone. Thanks very much for your participation this afternoon. As Matt said, coming to you here from the ACT in Australia. You may have seen on the poster, Sinead Nielsen, my colleague, unfortunately was unable to make the webinar today. She's unwell, so you've got me. Sorry about that. So a bit about the IPBC. Now, the partnership isn't a funding body. It's a partnership in the truest sense of the word. It's a partnership of like-minded organisations, and it aims to better connect governments, research organisations, non-governmental institutions that are working in the blue carbon space. And the aim of the IPBC is to very much build on the significant work and the initiatives that are currently underway in that area. The partnership was launched at the COP Conference of Parties in 2015 in Paris by 9 founding partners, and it has since expanded to over 50 partners, 51 now. And I think Lisa, who we'll hear from shortly from RARE, is our newest and our 51st partner. So thank you, Lisa, for that. The goals of the IPBC very much are to increase our international commitments to protect blue carbon and coastal ecosystems, improve the policy framework around that, and we'll unpack that a bit later on with our expert panel, and very much to accelerate the on-the-ground implementation of blue carbon protection and restoration activities. Now, the partnership does this by providing an open forum for those institutions, research institutions, non-government and governmental organisations, intergovernmental organisations, to connect, share, collaborate and build on solutions, and to take very practical actions so that we can, I guess, benefit and build on that experience of a global community. Some examples of the IPBC activities. There's a number of ways in which the partnership collaborates. We have the joint development of training resources, reports, research projects. We align our communication and our messaging around those larger environmental fora, such as the UNFCCC COP. And there are annual dialogues, knowledge sharing, webinars such as this, where we participate and bring together a united voice for blue carbon. One of the more practical examples of the IPBC's recent work is the launch of the Blue Carbon Accelerator Fund, and that's something which we're quite excited about. And the BCAF was established by Australia and the IUCN as a dedicated funding scheme to support blue carbon. And it was very much an idea that was originally conceived by the IPBC. The IPBC recognised that there was a key barrier to blue carbon action, and that was the shortage of investment-ready projects. So, working with the IUCN, we've now have the BCAF, and the idea is to increase the project value through the recognition of non-carbon benefits such as biodiversity, livelihood, and climate adaptation. The BCAF is currently open for the first round, which is the readiness round, and this is a call to action for project developers with activities to get coastal blue carbon projects ready for implementation and for that important future final private sector finance injection. The project calls are open now, and they're open until the 15th of May. And the overall aim there is to grow that global portfolio of credible and investment-ready blue carbon projects. We can unpack a bit more of that later on, but I'll throw this. There'll be a website, and there'll be further information opportunity to share. That's probably enough from me for the moment. I might ask my colleague Elisabetta to continue now and talk a bit more about the international frameworks and the work that the IPBC does there. Thanks, Elisabetta.
Thank you very much, David and Matt, for the introductions. So as mentioned by David, I'm gonna take you through an analysis that was conducted by the IPBC coordinator team just recently and was published as an overview report last year ahead of COP26. So this work is really an analysis of the main international frameworks and conventions that in a way address the conservation and protection of blue carbon ecosystems. This can be done either directly, so where conventions specifically address blue carbon ecosystems, or indirectly, where these frameworks address, for instance, the conservation of ecosystems at large. And so action on blue carbon ecosystems can contribute to the objectives of these frameworks, and vice versa, action on these frameworks can also have some benefits for blue carbon ecosystems. So the objective of this work was not only to provide an overview of what these international frameworks are, but especially also to dive into the details of what the reporting requirements are for parties to these conventions in a way to help countries streamline their action towards a multitude of international obligations and highlight where there are potential synergies and alignments in the action towards achieving those goals. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the first one that we analyzed is probably the only framework that really is about wetlands, and it is the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. For your information, the Secretariat of the Ramsar Convention is also a partner to the IPBC, and we work in close collaboration with them on a series of activities. The Ramsar Convention is about, in general, the conservation and sustainable use of all wetlands. Blue carbon ecosystems are specifically addressed by a series of documents part of the convention. The Strategic Plan 2016-2024, it has a couple of targets that specifically mention the conservation of blue carbon ecosystems, and it is linked to the use of wetlands as a climate change mitigation strategy. More recently at COP13, two resolutions, no, sorry, can we say Jan Ranzer? Sorry, David. Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry about that. More recently, COP13, sorry, at COP13, two resolutions were adopted, Resolution 1314 and 1320. First one on the promotion of the conservation, restoration, and sustainable management of coastal blue carbon ecosystems, which also encourages parties, to estimate carbon storage and fluxes in coastal blue carbon ecosystems, and Resolution 1320, promoting the conservation and wide use of wetlands and ecologically associated habitats. And this in particular relates also to the use of wetlands for climate change mitigation and adaptation. In terms of the reporting requirements for this convention, there are triennial national reports that parties are asked to submit to the Secretariat. And most importantly, we have the national wetland inventories that need to be compiled and submitted by countries. And we can already see now, and we will see it into more details later, that the data that is required for the compilation of the national wetland inventories will be also essential to the compilation of greenhouse gas inventories. So there's already a linkage in between the data streams for one convention and for reporting to another convention. Next slide, please. And the other important convention that we work on, of course, is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and all the related agreements. So the Paris Agreement as well, associated protocols, and other frameworks such as the REDD+ framework. In terms of the reference specifically to blue carbon ecosystems in this convention and associated protocols and other agreements, the UNFCCC promotes the conservation and sustainable management of all sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases, and among those specifically recognizes coastal and marine ecosystems. So that's where we have our traditional blue carbon ecosystems, mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrasses. In terms of the reporting requirements for countries, there are some of them that are slightly different for Annex 1 parties and non-Annex 1 parties based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And those are the national communications and the biennial reports, as well as what I was mentioning before, so an annual greenhouse gas inventory that Cass we'll talk about later on. In terms of then what is probably one of the most well-known reporting requirements of this whole framework is the nationally determined contribution by a country to the Paris Agreement. So I'm not gonna go into details. I will let Lisa expand on this, but this is extremely important as recently countries have started including a solid piece on blue carbon ecosystems into their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. And I have mentioned also the REDD+ framework. This one is not applicable to all blue carbon ecosystems, but in some countries, mangrove forests are accounted as forests, so they can fall under the framework of the REDD+. Next slide, please. These two main conventions, Ramsar and the UNFCCC, contribute widely to the reporting on the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In particular, I would like to highlight one of the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals, target 6.6 under Goal 6 on fresh water. And what is interesting here is that one of the indicators to track progress towards this target is compiled by the Secretariat of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands in collaboration with UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme. And the data that are submitted with the National Wetland Inventory that we mentioned before also inform this indicator. And it's the same, for instance, for indicator 13.2.1, which is under Goal 13 on climate change. In that indicator, the data that is submitted to the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat, so national communications and nationally determined contributions and so on, those policy measures at the national level are used to inform progress towards the achievement of Goal 13. I'm not going to go into the details of all the others, but I have also included here, of course, Goal 14 on oceans and Goal 15 on ecosystems, biodiversity at large, that they are all relevant to blue carbon ecosystems more indirectly, let's say. None of them specifically include a mention to blue carbon ecosystems, but they overall address the conservation of all ecosystems, including coastal and marine. As reporting requirements, countries are asked to submit voluntary national reviews, and the high-level political forum on sustainable development is also informed by the Global Sustainable Development Report and an annual SDG progress report that is compiled with all the data that informs the different indicators under all the targets. So just looking at these three frameworks, we can see how many synergies there are and how action towards one of these frameworks can actually benefit action towards others. Next slide, please. I'm just quickly touching on other conventions that we have included in our analysis, because they are very much relevant to blue carbon ecosystems as well. Of course, we have the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, that addresses more in general the conservation and protection of all ecosystems. I've mentioned here Article 8 on conservation and Article 10 on the sustainable use of ecosystems. And of importance this year in particular is the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This has been drafted and will be discussed for adoption at the next COP of CBD later this year. And what is important for blue carbon ecosystem is that in this framework, the conservation of ecosystems is clearly linked to climate action. So that's exactly where blue carbon ecosystems fit. Another instrument is UNESCO's World Heritage Convention. This is a very important conservation instrument in that it protects the world's natural heritage sites. And UNESCO has recently conducted an analysis over all the marine sites. There are 50 around the world, and 21 of them are specifically recognized for the value of the blue carbon ecosystems that are located in the sites. So action towards the protection of world's natural heritage is actually action that benefits the conservation of blue carbon ecosystems. And a final one that we have included is the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. This is more on the adaptation side of climate action. So blue carbon ecosystems, when healthy, are recognized for their capacity to protect coastlines and contribute to livelihoods of coastal communities in particular. So this is another aspect that is very much linked to blue carbon action, more on the adaptation side. Next slide, please. In conclusion, we wanted also to have general frameworks that can act as umbrella for action and really drive countries' actions towards the protection of blue carbon ecosystems. Those are the United Nations decades that are proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly. And for the years 2021 to 2030, we have two important decades. One is the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and the other one is the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. So, of course, on the ecosystem restoration, the first one, we see how this is very much relevant for work on blue carbon ecosystems, as it is about protecting and conserving and sustainably using all ecosystems type. And we saw an intersection, ideally, with the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development with blue carbon ecosystems, because it's like the coastal area. It's really the ideal intersection in between a decade on restoration of all ecosystems type and a decade on the ocean more specifically, but for sustainable development. So in a way, the conservation and restoration of ecosystems for the ultimate goal of supporting sustainable development of our society. Next slide, please. So that was my last slide, and I would like, this was just an overview, but I really invite you to check the report that on which this presentation is based. It is available on the IPBC website on the resources page. And just to let you know also that, of course, this international arena of frameworks and conventions is constantly evolving. So at every time that we have a conference of the parties, then new resolutions can be adopted, or some of these frameworks can change, can be updated in what is their blue carbon components. So this is actually a live document. So it's going to be constantly, regularly updated by the IPBC coordinator to stay relevant for all its partners. And yes, regular updates will be available through the website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David and Elisabetta. So from Ramsar to Sendai and all conventions in between, we have quite a portfolio of frameworks and conventions that all tend to work together to achieve multiple objectives. I'm sure you've got questions, not too many popping up yet. Scientists might, of which there's many on the call, looking at some of the names, scientists might be interested in questions about how the information that they collect is relevant to some of the reporting that David and Elisabetta highlighted. Policymakers, of course, will naturally have questions related to how the work they're doing is related to national commitments. So please don't hesitate to post your questions in the Q&A. David, you might like to pop the BSAF call in the chat, the link to that, and Elisabetta might like to pop the link to the report in the chat as well. And I'll try and also pop a link in the chat to the Hub resources website, which has some of those. We talk, well, Elisabetta, mentioned nationally determined contributions. And so to pick up that theme and drill into it a little bit more, we have Lisa Schindler-Murray from RARE. Lisa is a senior manager of policy and partnerships from RARE, which is a conservation organisation that's focused on behavioural and community change. So looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Lisa, over to you. And by the way, you have plenty of time.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen now. Thank you so much for the introduction and for being here. As we mentioned, my presentation focuses on blue carbon and the nationally determined contributions, or the NDCs. And having just a little bit of technical difficulty. 1 second.
We can hear you and we can see the screen so far.
Fantastic. Great. And so I wanted to start with the NDC presentation with just the visual of the type of blue carbon ecosystems that we're referring to, or that I'm referring to in this presentation, based on the latest science and IPCC reports. So these are seagrass meadows, tidal salt marshes, and mangrove forests. And you'll hear a lot more from Kath later about how these can be part of a greenhouse gas inventory. You may also hear different terms such as nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based adaptation when talking about restoration, conservation, and sustainable management of blue carbon ecosystems. And it's this variety that is actually one of the valuable benefits of blue carbon as a climate solution in these international frameworks. It allows for the flexibility needed to engage local communities, national and subnational governments, and implementers alike. And so before diving into the NDC examples, there are a few of categories of blue carbon actions that all contribute to enhancing ambition through an NDC or other climate action plans. So mitigation potential for blue carbon ecosystems obviously gets a lot of attention in terms of its ability to enhance climate ambition, mitigate against climate change, and was particularly relevant in the latest IPCC report from Working Group 3 on mitigation that was released last week. The latest report was a huge moment to solidify blue carbon as a science-based approach with international validation that these actions are not only a valuable mitigation strategy, but also an encouraged one to be included in an NDC or other climate action plans. Adaptation and resilience actions, like ecosystem-based adaptation in sustainable fisheries, is also recognized more and more for its mitigation co-benefits, making it another avenue for demonstrating enhanced ambition in an NDC. And this was also noted in the recent IPCC report, given the importance of coastal ecosystems for local coastal communities, food security, biodiversity, and protecting against flood surges. And innovative financing is critical to support sustainable blue carbon actions in using market-based approaches or non-market activities. And these can also be included in NDC. And so some of these type of financing engagements could be carbon markets, whether that's voluntary or regulatory, innovative non-carbon approaches like resilience credits, and other international or bilateral investments through public funding. So with that overview in mind about how blue carbon actions can be used to facilitate enhanced climate ambition, we can see how including any element of those type of activities in an NDC would indicate a country's priorities or ambitions across levels, national or local. And it serves as a climate action plan outlining its goals, targets, and intended approach for blue carbon. For this latest round of NDCs, 71 countries out of the 131 who had submitted it by the end of October when this paper was published included coastal or marine nature-based solutions in their new or updated NDC. And as you can see from the graph, the majority of countries include coastal blue carbon ecosystems as a joint approach for mitigation and adaptation. And I should note that this statistic does not cover the level of inclusion in the NDC or for the ecosystem actions, as in some cases it is referenced in the narrative quite broadly, and others it's more specific targets aligned with mitigation or adaptation goals. So the NDCs are prepared on a cyclical basis as part of the ambition mechanism for every 5 years. So most countries have submitted their latest NDC, let's say in 2020, but it sort of went from 2021 to 2022 given the pandemic. But the ambition cycle continues for the next NDC round to start in 2025. So we're now in the implementation phase of this current set of NDCs. And each cycle demonstrates a more ambitious climate plan based on national capacity. And ensuring the most updated information is included or highlighting relevant planning processes. All of these can be examples of different types of ways that you could include or represent your blue carbon information and to demonstrate greater ambition. Additionally, other national reports are also an international policy opportunity to demonstrate enhanced ambition and complementarity to climate commitments. So specifying linkages with other conventions like the UN Convention on Biological Diversity or to for the Sustainable Development Goals. These are all ways to highlight the synergies between global challenges, which supports ambitious actions across these themes. And this is aligned with what Elisabetta was sharing earlier. And additionally, it's worth noting that within a climate context, there are other ways to link blue carbon and its ambition potential and its mitigation and adaptation potential, such as by ensuring these actions get incorporated into inputs for the global stocktake, which is when the UNFCCC will assess global progress towards achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. Okay, so let's dive into a few examples in NDC examples that integrated blue carbon in different ways. Our first example is from the Seychelles, which showed its increased ambition using a clear stepwise approach, really ramping up its blue carbon ambition overall. It notably focused on adaptation, its adaptation contribution, and on safeguarding the blue economy and blue carbon ecosystems. The Seychelles further articulated its climate ambitions to include blue carbon as part of its future mitigation target, while outlining that it will start by laying the foundation to understand the full potential and to build technical capacity needed to implement the IPCC wetland supplement in its greenhouse gas inventory. So this meant starting with the political commitment and resources to map the extent of its seagrass meadows, all while utilizing existing national processes like the Marine Spatial Plan. So while the Seychelles is not currently implementing the wetland supplement for its inventory, it does note its intent to do so in the next NDC. And this level of political commitment is another way that the NDC can serve as a driving force for national priority setting and intended ambition. It's also only one of 10 countries as of the end of October who included a direct reference to the IPCC wetland supplement, which is impressive, and we'll hear more about the supplement in the next presentation. And so on the screen, I have a couple examples from the Seychelles NDC highlighting the different ways that these commitments or targets could be outlined, whether that's a policy process to integrate nature-based solutions in coastal development and infrastructure planning, or an area-based target like the 100% protected area for seagrass and mangrove areas by 2030. And others provide a clear hook to mitigation co-benefits. And having that hook is particularly relevant if included in the information necessary to facilitate clarity, transparency, and understanding or the ICTU in UNFCCC speak, which opens the door to start including relevant information in the national reports and the enhanced transparency framework, as well as it provides a clearer runway for enhanced ambition using blue carbon in the next NDC. So our next example is Mozambique. And Mozambique has made a lot of technical headway through its REDD+ program with the World Bank over recent years. And that REDD+ program includes mangroves as forests, which you heard recently from Elizabeth about sometimes mangroves can be part of a REDD+ approach. So the mangroves and the REDD+ mitigation contribution is still also noted in a stepwise fashion in this NDC. Instead of being directly part of Mozambique's greenhouse gas inventory or its mitigation target, it states that it's a key means of implementation to operationalize the mitigation ambitions. It's not necessarily that it's part of the overall sector-based mitigation target. It also gives an area-based target under mitigation for mangroves, while at the same time highlighting mangrove restoration as an activity-based target under adaptation. And so this difference, both of these are different ways that you can incorporate blue carbon in your NDC using a flexible approach. Further, under the adaptation section, Mozambique's NDC does a really nice job of linking policy processes across forums. So highlighting where certain targets can be linked to the national biodiversity strategy, for example, and these linkages are important, an important step towards identifying the synergies between conventions. And lastly, on Mozambique's NDC, it specifies that it wants to eventually be supported by market mechanisms with high environmental integrity that contribute to sustainable development and harness the strength of the private sector, as long as it ensures environmental integrity and no double counting. And so lastly, to close, here are the three things that I hope you take away. One, there's multiple actions and commitments that can be taken to enhance ambition with blue carbon, depending on national and local priorities related to mitigation, adaptation, or financing, or all three. Two, a stepwise approach provides a feasible way to set the groundwork for enabling conditions for blue carbon action and teeing up a more robust approach for carbon accounting. And starting with adaptation and resilience actions is an excellent way to do this, to show progress and to get the buy-in from local communities and stakeholders. And three, the NDC is not the only mechanism for climate action for blue carbon. And now that we're in the implementation phase for NDCs, it will be really important to show what was included can be successfully implemented so that the next formulation in 2025 can go a step or two further. But in the meantime, other policy processes can be complementary, like the national adaptation plans or the biodiversity strategies or SDGs. And finally, maybe I'll add a fourth final point. I would be remiss to close this presentation without a plug to remind any of the governments or stakeholders on the call about the first annual Ocean Climate Dialogue that will be held at the upcoming UNFCCC session in June. The dialogue will serve as a critical place to share experiences, strengthen ocean climate action, including for blue carbon for mitigation and adaptation. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with all of you today, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
And thank you, Lisa. So NDC's nationally determined contributions are one of the key policy mechanisms that a country has to communicate what its intentions are and what it's actually doing. There's often a lot of confusion about what an NDC is, and so presentations such as Lisa are important to demystify. You know, for example, I've found that some folk tend to confuse NDCs with the process for doing the carbon accounting. Of course, as Lisa's explained, that's not what the NDCs do. There is a separate process for that Kath Lovelock is going to tell us about. So what better segue do we need than to go from NDCs, and Lisa mentioned something called the Wetland Supplement, which I'm sure Kath's going to tell us a little bit more about. So Kath, going from Berlin to Brisbane, Kath Lovelock, I can tell you, is a professor at the University of Queensland, but also is one of the foremost experts in this thing we're calling blue carbon, and manages to combine breadth and depth in a way that I think is pretty unique. So over to you, Kath. Oh, and by the way, thank you for the questions that are coming. Keep them coming in, and we will hold the question session at the end. Kath, you have plenty of time.
Oh, thanks, Matt, and thanks for the very nice introduction, I must say. I'm going to share my screen, if I can find the... no, hang on a minute. I've got a problem. All right.
We always have a backup in case.
Yeah, it's just sort of hang on. All right. Too many windows, my friend. Too many windows. All right, and I'm going to full screen. Okay, so today I want to talk about blue carbon within national greenhouse gas inventories, and I'm talking about a project that we undertook last year, funded by the Australian government, and it was led by a person called Carly Green. And Carly is with a bunch of coastal wetland people. So really, I suppose I wanted to draw that to your attention to begin with, is that Carly's an expert in greenhouse gas inventories, and not necessarily in coastal wetlands, but in the forest sector, and particularly has had experience with REDD+, with a range of countries. She's also an author on IPCC guidance documents as well. So the great thing about this is that we were able to think about coastal wetlands with the knowledge that Carly has about how how greenhouse gas inventories are done for other ecosystems, right? Terrestrial forests. So that was a great learning experience for us all, I must say. So we're talking about blue carbon in this case. We're only talking about seagrass and mangroves and salt marshes, because these are the ecosystems where there is guidance provided by the IPCC within the Coastal Wetland Supplement. So the guidance for these three ecosystems varies a little bit, in that it is much more comprehensive for mangroves and for salt marshes than it is for seagrass. That poses problems, well, not problems, challenges. But the great thing about the project that we did is that we actually tried to identify some solutions if seagrass just happens to be one of the key categories or that is within your country. Okay, so what I'm talking about is this document. So it's also available on the International Partnership for Blue Carbon's website through the resources part. And this is, it's not a short report, it's actually pretty comprehensive. And it is really provides advice on how you go about including these coastal wetlands within national greenhouse gas inventories. And it provides, it's pretty clear from what Lisa showed that, everybody would have done it if it was really easy, but it's not so easy. So it seemed to the partnership that it was a really good idea to put some advice together to try and stimulate the adoption of the wetland supplement and other, look at how it really can be done in the simplest way, all right? So people would, countries would want to include coastal wetlands in their greenhouse gas inventories to improve monitoring and reporting on blue carbon ecosystems, right? So basically by doing that, it allows nations to reap the benefits of their investment in their actions. in conservation and restoration of blue carbon ecosystems. So it allows you to really, have the data to report on your NDC commitments, for example. And of course, as pointed out by Elisabetta and also Lisa, that it aligns with reporting on multiple agreements and conventions and also national policies in many cases. So it's an exercise that might be difficult to achieve, but it's well worth it, and you can get multiple outcomes while doing it. So what this advice document covers is the sections from the IPCC Wetland Supplement, which I've got pictured there, that are concerned with coastal wetlands. It also covers sections from the 2006 guidance, and they are, like sections that are common with other elements that you would be reporting. So the representation of lands, for example. So it has that, considers that as well. And it considers sections from the 2019 refinement, which was approved last year, right? So that had another element of wetlands, which included flooded lands, right? So there's that to think about as well. We used experience of nations who have included blue carbon in their inventories, and that would be the USA and Australia. And then we were really, really grateful to have the governments of Indonesia and Fiji participate in workshops and also in reviewing the document to sort of look at this idea of building consistency in approaches for measurement, reporting and verification, so MRV, with REDD+ commitments. So this was an effort to try and sort of streamline these approaches. So what we have at the front of the document that is a really quick and intense but good read is the key messages. So basically these are like, what we really want, what the most valuable message was out of the section that is embedded in the report. So this is sort of like the guide. And here's an example here. It's like relevance to forest reference, so FRELs, forest reference emission levels and forest reference levels. And it says that, mangroves can be included in REDD+ if they fall under the nation's definition of a forest. Look at section 2.3, for example. And if you've got mangroves in your forest category, if you've got other kinds of mangroves that don't meet the definition of a forest, for example, scrub mangroves, then you can put those in the wetland category in your inventory reports. And like Lisa says, one of the big messages here is a stepwise approach is really important. So you can improve data and methodologies over time, and you can keep your eyes on this mutual consistency. So there's a range of examples given in boxes to sort of demonstrate the concepts. So so the key messages are in these categories, right? And some of them are within the design decisions as you're attempting to sort of bring the coastal wetlands into your greenhouse gas inventory. And they have topics like, the land representation, stratification of your mangroves into different kinds of categories, methods, approaches, and tiers that you might be intending to use, and key category analyses. I mean, what do you want to focus on? What's the most important thing here, rather than trying to do everything all at one time? And the same with relevant carbon pools and gases. There's also methodological considerations. Some of the most important ones are whether you want to do an activity-based approach, so where you're looking at particular activities and how much, so for example, area they cover, or the managed land proxy approach, which is one that is used by the US. So I won't go through this list. I'm going to leave you to explore the document, I think, but there's, I do recommend that you take a look at these key messages. And I think I have a couple of additional examples, ones that I'm like. So, for example, there's a lot of countries that don't have a lot of data, right? So, and that is particularly the case, it seems, in the Indian Ocean. So what do you do in those cases when, well, we point out that there is global data available, and we have a great big list of resources of where you can go to look at some of that global data. But we also acknowledge that many countries don't want to use global data because it may not be, you know, appropriate, right? There might be errors, it's not verified. So we provide you know, the advice that if you do use national data, how you can go about, global data, how you can go about verifying that, and the importance, for example, of experts in doing that. So there's a whole range of resources that include links to these data sources that you might wish to look at. Now, of course, that is going to be dated or date very quickly because there's so much coming online all the time. So really, I'm getting to my final slides here, in that seagrass is a challenge. I said that in the beginning. And I would say it's a challenge, but it's worth it. And I suppose one of the key recommendations is that, you know, if you want to include seagrass, then it's really important to define your coastal land and what it includes, to think about developing your national mapping to include it, as well as collecting other data. So here, for example, is an example time series that you might develop, or that a country might develop, for land use transitions in seagrass, from seagrass being dredged to unvegetated sediment to it being, say, for example, restored, and how that might play out in your inventory. So finally, the key messages is, you know, like a positive one, in that you can include coastal wetlands in your national greenhouse gas inventory, even if your data sets are not perfect. So we recommend an incremental inclusion. Probably one of the other key messages is get your national experts together and work out how to share data. Indonesia provides some really interesting examples of how that was achieved. Focusing on key categories to begin with, and to try not to be overwhelmed by the sheer amount of work that might be involved here. And then finally, as I said before, seagrass is going to be a little bit difficult, but it's worth it. And I think the data are coming slowly but steadily for that ecosystem. So finally, the acknowledgements are rather large here, but I would like to especially acknowledge Nikki Fitzgerald, who was instrumental in this process and really pushed us to do a practical and useful guide, I think. And then finally, gratitude particularly to Fiji and Indonesia, and then all of the people who read and reviewed and tried to make this a better product. Thank you.
And thank you, Kath. So Kath, you mentioned that the information available for the Indian Ocean is a bit sparse, which is, I think, a very accurate observation. And then you mentioned that, I guess, if nations are wanting to pick up their aspirations, there are a few places to start. Are there any musings that you can make about where some of the people online might go to start collecting the first bits of information? For example, you know, collecting the carbon stock is perhaps the easiest place to start, but if emissions are more important, is it the best place to start? What are your sort of off-the-cuff thoughts on that?
I think it really depends on national circumstances. You know, I think, you know, nations are in the best position to sort of understand what's important. And I think you know, that getting the experts together within country is really important, and kind of setting up those networks to share data, because often, you know, like somebody is doing something over here, and this includes your your academic institutions and research institutions and others, right? Because, you know, often, you know, if you're sitting in one office for the inventory, that you may not necessarily know what's going on, but there may be more data than you think. And I also think that expert knowledge and expert opinion is also evidence and can be used, for example, to verify what you might consider in the global data sets.
Excellent, thanks, Kath. So over to the questions for the panel, and there are a few coming in. It's a little quieter than what we normally have for a hub webinar, so folk, don't be shy. I know the folks of the Indian Ocean aren't usually that shy, so get into it. I'm going to start with a question from Cairo. Hello, Cairo. I hope all is well over in Kenya. Cairo had a question for Lisa, mentioning that, and Lisa talked about we're in implementation phase, and Cairo said the challenge now is the implementation of blue carbon focused NDCs, and that national mangrove management is a priority area in Kenya. And then the question for you, Lisa, is do you have any idea of how Kenya and other countries can finance these activities? There's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question, and probably the question for many people, with financing being such a key challenge for blue carbon or for implementing the NDC actions in general. I think that, I guess one thing that I would say is that both as public funders are supporting their portfolios and kind of looking how to ensure that their financial support is going to implement national priorities that are indicated in the NDC, that could be one starting point to kind of be able to harness the public funder financing streams that are looking to be able to ensure that there's implementing the national reports that are coming out through the Paris Agreement. I would say that that's also the same and quite similar approach for things like the post-2020 biodiversity framework as well, and how countries will be using those commitments to help direct funding from public sources. The other would be, of course, on the private sector side, there's a lot of interest in blue carbon, especially in the recent years. And so if there's a way to harness that interest in a responsible way from the private sector, that will also be one avenue to be able to look at other financing blue carbon actions. From the NDC perspective, the last thing that I'll mention is that using conditionality in the next NDC, when it's formulated, would be another way to highlight what could be possible with additional financing. And so that could serve as a guidepost for funders when you're looking to be able to implement the blue carbon actions that are in the NDC, but want to note what's possible now and what's possible with more financing. So those are, I guess, a few areas. And then, of course, in terms of current opportunities, is the readiness support from the Blue Carbon Accelerator Fund, that could also be another starting point.
Thanks, Lisa. And I guess it also seems to me that, from the presentation that Elisabetta gave, that if you do an activity that addresses a commitment from one of the conventions, then you're also probably helping address an activity in one of the other ones. And so there might be ways to leverage some of that when seeking some finance. So on the subject of finance, we had a question from somebody from the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub. So Kai Kim, hello Kai. Kai is based in Seychelles and had a question around the wetland supplement. I think this is directed at, it's the scientific basis for the seagrass targets is not actually clear and has not been provided to the decision makers. Now, Kath, I think seagrasses are in the wetland supplement. the number of pages devoted to seagrass is probably less than the number of pages devoted to some of the other ecosystems, perhaps because the information is a little bit less robust. What do you think?
Yeah, well, you know, you can think that the 2013 wetland supplement is now getting old, right? And so at that time, the authors did their best to assemble all the data they could, but basically they only included one activity, right? So, which is excavation, essentially. So there aren't any other emission factors provided in the as a T or 1 default values in the supplement, right? But countries can go to tier 2 and tier 3 reporting, and if they provide the justification and the science, then they can include other things, right, in their inventories, for example. But really what we're looking at from, you know, why they aren't as well represented is that the science was not as developed in 2013, right, you know. So it really is a case of countries needing to sort of develop their own decisions about how to accommodate seagrasses in their inventories.
Thanks, Catherine. And certainly seagrass provides some interesting, thought-provoking questions as well. You know, some of the intertidal ecosystems, if we're excavating them, then we're reasonably sure that emissions go straight into the atmosphere where we know they're damaging. Whereas if things are happening underwater where seagrasses are, then it's dissolved in the water, and we know a lot less about what happens to those kind of dissolved gases. So yes, there's some things we need to learn. So come on, scientists out there, we've got a lot of work to do. We can.
Matt, the mapping is also, you know, like there isn't a global seamless map, and it's very difficult for countries to understand change, right? And so reporting on land use change is, you know, fundamental to the greenhouse gas inventories, and so that is also quite difficult. But you know, countries like Lisa spoke, the Seychelles and Fiji and others are really trying to make some headway into this, and I think this also reflects actually on the other alignments with other conventions as well, because seagrass are certainly extraordinarily important for biodiversity.
Very good point, Kath. Yes, mapping. We've got some challenges, but I certainly feel like it's a tractable problem that we're making good progress on. So. All right, more questions. I'm just scrolling, so bear with me while I scroll. I'm jumping between chat and Q&A because it seems like they're coming in from both directions. Question from Thomas Krimmel. Hello again, Thomas. Thomas asked whether there was a window of opportunity for an IORA funding facility to get engaged in the funding of blue carbon projects for IORA member states. Thomas, well, I can't, as always, speak on behalf of the IORA Secretariat. An IORA funding facility would, of course, be a wonderful thing, but something that we do have that I know IORA member states can apply for is the Blue Carbon Accelerator Fund. So maybe I'll throw to David. Did you want to take that opportunity just to tell us a little bit more about that fund and what IORA member states or states of the Indian Ocean might be able to do to access it? David, you might want to unmute yourself so that we can hear you.
You got me now?
Gotcha.
Yeah, cool. So I guess in terms of eligibility, the main thing is that the list of eligible countries is based on what the OECD is classifying as a developing country. So that's the first premise around BCAF eligibility. Don't have that list immediately to hand, but that would be the first thing. If you are recognized as a developing country under the OECD framework, then yes, your project would be eligible. The other point from that, it then comes into the type of activity that you are looking to undertake within the specified, blue carbon ecosystem. And again, I might just throw that into the chat about what those eligible activities are. Yeah, that might be easier. It's quite an extensive list that I've got from the framework document.
Sure, that'd be handy. I think in terms of developing country for the Indian Ocean, I think we're Australia, Singapore and Oman don't qualify, but probably everybody else does. So thanks again, Thomas. I know that you've asked questions like that before, and so we just keep having that conversation with the Secretariat, of course, what the opportunities are for member states that we might be able to create through the IORA framework. So still on the Q&A tab that I'm looking at, and Kai again asked, what are the best examples of blue carbon policies that the panel could recommend? Wow, that's a pretty big one, Kai. And what are the key elements that should be considered in the development of such a policy? Who wants to take that one? Elisabetta, that you talked about all manner of frameworks for policies. Did you want to take that one? And maybe unmute yourself so we can hear you.
Sorry about that. Yes, sure. To be honest, I'm not in a position to recommend like best blue carbon policies, and that's the short answer. And apart from that, I would say that like all the work that has been done by the IPBC coordinator is to really try to go from the international level down to the national level and understand challenges. And we are also, and the reason there is not a best policy is that the national contexts are very different. So one country can have some challenges and barriers to the protection of blue carbon ecosystems. And one very basic example is the fact that in some countries, blue carbon ecosystems fall under the mandate of different ministries. So it can be the Ministry of Environment, but also the Ministry of Economy, but also the Ministry of Forestry, and so on and so forth. So this makes it difficult to, in a way, provide standards for national policies. But of course, what we are trying to do is like to connect different countries, especially from different regions of the world, to understand, so that they can learn from each other, they can understand from other experiences if some countries are experiencing the same challenges and how they could overcome them. So we really work on knowledge exchange and exchange of best practices and lessons learned. And another thing that I might want also to give you as an example is that, and this is also something that maybe Kath could comment on. Some partners are currently, some IPBC partners are currently working also on identifying steps at the national level for countries on how really to go, for instance, from a policy to then a project. And, you know, like providing this step-by-step approach could also be a guidance for them to understand where they are in the process and how they can move from one step to the other. So again, I'm sorry I cannot really provide a list of best practices because we don't have any, but we're really trying to promote this exchange among countries to kind of let them understand how they could do it in their national context.
That's a very reasonable answer, Elisabetta. I thought it was a challenging question for you to grapple with. Did anyone, Lisa and Kath, I might go to Lisa first.
Thanks. Yeah, I was also wanted to say that, I wouldn't point out a best policy, as it would very much depend on the national and local context. But flexibility is really kind of key, including across blue carbon themes, whether it's mitigation policies, adaptation policies, or financing, as well as setting the stage for enabling conditions. All of these would be considered vital blue carbon policies. And so whether that's ranging from the national mangrove strategies, like we just heard about from Kenya, or meadows in the Seychelles, as a way to have a pre-feasibility to set the stage for future policies that start linking into blue carbon. All of these, I think, would be are critical and important blue carbon policies, regardless of the stage and angle. So it could be coming at it from the early stages to really understand the technical barriers, as well as mitigation or adaptation policies. And as well as even into development policies that could be ecosystem-based adaptation in development and infrastructure planning. All of those would be a blue carbon policy bundle.
So, Kath.
Yeah, I just, in terms of policy in Australia, I wanted to, well, one thing that we've been pretty excited about has been the blue carbon method for the carbon market, for the Australian voluntary carbon market. So I'll put the link in the chat, but that's been a step forward, I think, for Australia, and we're looking forward to seeing how it is going to be, how it's going to roll out. But there's some good resources as an example of something that is viewed in Australia as a nationally appropriate way to incorporate blue carbon.
Thanks, Kath. Yes, that would be a really useful resource to pop in the chat there. Before you do it, though, the questions are coming in quickly now, which is more like the Indian Ocean that I know and love. And there's one from Cairo again, around your comment that Australia and the US implementing the wetland supplement, but some of the other countries are still working up to that. So Cairo's question is this because of ignorance or otherwise? Now that the supplement needs review, how do we assure that they are accepted by parties and utilised?
Ooh, that's complicated. I actually, can you break that down again? I'm sorry, but it seemed to have multiple parts.
It does have multiple parts. So I think the two parts to it. One part was, why aren't more countries yet incorporating the wetland supplement or using the wetland supplement in their greenhouse gas inventories? The second part is that I think Cairo is also mentioning that the supplement is ready to be reviewed. And so during that process, is there a way that the review can make it, I guess, more acceptable to other countries to start implementing?
They're really good points. Now, I think a lot of countries haven't adopted the wetland supplement because it's so challenging. And I would guess that most greenhouse gas inventory teams are under-resourced, and so I think there's a whole lot of issues like that. It's quite a big job. Most inventory compilers are compiling over multiple sectors, and to start including a new category is actually a whole bunch of work, right? And so no, Cairo, not ignorance, kind of capacity and willingness, right? So in Australia, the greenhouse gas inventory team started to include blue carbon because of the intense pressure from industry and the state governments and others to actually, start to be able to, so that we could actually kick off and start doing blue carbon projects. So I think it's, you know, it's a challenge, and it has challenges on multiple levels, right, that each country's just got to work their way through. And as to the revision of the supplement, you know, the values are still good. I'm not saying they're not, you know, but most of the time, if you know, the data that's coming online now is more comprehensive. And excuse the birds in the background, right? You can probably go off the curlews. But I mean, I think that's when you have to go to tier 2 and tier 3, right? And that is perfectly defensible, you know. And so the tier 1 values that are in the supplement sort of say, okay, here's a category, you know, here's a, you know, mangroves in tropical regions and those in dry regions do this, but you can improve on that as a nation and build your own factors, which then require the evidence. And Indonesia's been really great at doing that, and Fiji has also been able to do that.
Thanks, Kath. Yeah, I think we're all on a journey, right? And you know, this is something we're all trying to work out together to get there. There's a question from Lisa, going back to finance. So Lisa, do you have any examples of countries that are working to aggregate small community projects so that they are attractive for finance?
That's another really good question. So there are, from an NDC perspective, you know, of implementing climate and blue carbon projects, I think that's an excellent idea. And I don't have any examples on hand that would be able to, I'd be able to point to, but I do think that the idea is a good one, to be able to start thinking about how to show the connectivity and show kind of a networked approach. Rare has been able to do this from a fisheries perspective. And so I think that there's a lot of lessons that can be drawn from looking at locally managed marine protected areas or managed access area and reserves that are more at that small scale and local level, that can taking those lessons and can be applied for blue carbon actions, whether that's for restoration, conservation, or sustainable management, or combination. And so I think that there's a lot of potential with a networked approach for blue carbon, and that we can learn from some of the existing efforts, from whether it's from fisheries, small scale fishers, or from you know, locally managed MPAs and managed access areas and reserves. But it's a good one to continue looking into further, especially to ensure the engagement, the direct engagement in across all levels of participation from local communities, ensuring that they're part of the planning process and the decision-making process when it comes to developing what that looks like across the board.
Thanks, Lisa. And it strikes me that maybe Lalau in Madagascar and Cairo in Kenya might have some insights on that particular question as well. So feel free to chime in the chat, Lalau or Cairo. Over to South Africa. Hello, Jackie. Jackie has got a question going back to seagrass and mapping, and Kath making the point around seagrass and mapping. Mapping change is complicated in seagrass because it is often naturally dynamic, and patches can be lost due to some hydrological disturbances that are not related to specific human activities. And here's the question. It's a challenging one again, Kath. We specialise in challenging questions in the Indian Ocean, I think. Is there any guidance for accounting for natural variability in area change in blue carbon accounting, and do we need to do it?
There isn't anything specific for blue carbon ecosystems, but there is a whole chapter on that in the 2019 refinement, right? And that's because many countries know that, are affected by La Nina, El Nino cycles. And so trying to detect a change against a big background noise is a challenge for almost everybody. And so, Jackie, I'd go and have a look at the natural, I think the shorthand chapter was natural variation, but there is a bunch of guidance on that. And I think it's, so you can imagine if you're mapping seagrass, then you've got to map it for a number of years to understand what that background variation is before you can detect a trend down or up, right? And, probably the scale of your mapping and detection is also really important there. So I can't recall the key messages of that interannual variation chapter from the 2019 refinement, but I do know it's there.
And on that subject, I see in the chat that Solrun from Norway has put a link in regarding drone-based mapping of seagrass. Thanks, Solrun. There's certainly lots of interest in drone-based research infrastructure for mapping seagrass. So take a look at that. I'll have a look at it. Looks interesting. All right, how are we going with our questions? Back over to the Q&A. A question from Vadim Petrov. Hello, Vadim. Vadim, I think, and this one might be for David or Elisabetta. I'll let the two of you choose which like to answer that. Vadim is from the State Oceanographic Institute of Roshi Hydromet, and wants to know whether their institution, a scientific institution, can participate in the IPBC. So, Elisabetta or David, over to you. And while you're doing that, I'm going to scroll for other questions.
David, I answer? You answer? I answer? Okay. So yes, just on behalf of the IPBC coordinator team that is shared between the Australian Government Department for Agriculture, Water and the Environment and the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO. So we have, and we can put that into the chat box. So we have very simply an email address where we receive expressions of interest from institutions or countries, government agencies that are interested in joining the partnership. And on our website, we also have information available of what the role of an IPBC partner is, and that can also help you in case understand if that if your organization is willing to join the IPBC as a partner, or maybe keep in contact for collaboration or on specific activities only. I see that David has put the email address in the chat, so I invite anyone that is interested to in getting more information about this process to just contact us in the interest of time. I think I will stop there, Matt. And thanks, David, for also posting the link to the partners role. Thanks.
Thank you, Elisabetta. And going back to the Q&A, I see that I missed a question, another one from Kai Kim over in the Seychelles. Question for Kath. Is there more information on the UNESCO 2021 report on the carbon value of the marine heritage sites, on how they estimated I think this is the World Heritage Blue Carbon Assessment, right? How they estimated the carbon sequestration value within seagrass meadows. Now, is that carbon stock or is that economic value? I'm not sure. It's been a while since I read that report myself.
I think it's just the stocks.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think there was any estimate of a sequestration rate in that. I think it's the stocks in comparison to the estimated global stocks,
Okay.
to suggest basically that the World Heritage sites are well worth our while in acting in to conserve and restore.
And if I recall correctly, the process that they followed for doing that measure largely followed the Blue Carbon Manual Guide, right, for doing the calculations on carbon stock. So
Yeah, and it used data, for example, for the mangrove soil carbon, it used the Sandeman et al. Coverage and, so forth. So it used, what data was available from the global data sources.
that's right. So Kai, there's certainly a few resources on the Hub website, including the Blue Carbon Manual, which outlines right down in a lot of detail about how you calculate carbon stock. And on the Hub website, under our resources page, there's also a link to our YouTube channel, and that channel has a bunch of training videos, including some actual demonstrations of not only how to go into, for example, a seagrass and collect the core, but exactly what you do with it afterwards and how you turn that into estimates of carbon stock. So feel free to jump on and use those resources. So I'm looking at the time and we are very close to the end, and I'm just scrolling. I don't see any more questions popping up, but I'm just making sure for a second that I haven't missed any. I don't think I have. Right. And the panel can tell me if I missed one. I'm multitasking here, not always my strongest skill set. So in that case, I think it's up to me to round things off. So, the intent for this particular webinar was to try and I guess co-host with the IPBC a webinar that talked more about international policies and some of the frameworks for, in particular, Indian Ocean countries to think about, but of course it's wider than that, the general audience. And so we started off with David introducing what the IPBC is and what it's all about. Elizabeth took us through a whole suite of the global frameworks and the global conventions that we might want to be thinking about in terms of its national commitments or even our collective aspiration about what it is that we're trying to achieve, all the way from climate mitigation to disaster risk reduction and, of course, protection of biodiversity. Lisa picked up on that and really drilled into this thing called nationally determined contributions and really explained that it's a way for countries to put on the global stage the activities that they are taking and intending to take to reduce the sort of the emissions that they're producing, but also adapting to some of the change that is inevitable, and along the way generate a whole suite of benefits from biodiversity to livelihoods. And then one of those actions that countries can take is to pick up some of the IPCC guidelines, in particular the guidelines around coastal wetlands. And Kath told us a little bit about exactly how you'd start doing that. She mentioned that it's not easy, and that's possibly a reason why not too many countries are doing that yet, but you have to start somewhere. And so Kath outlined some of the places that you might like to start. This webinar has been recorded. It will be posted on our YouTube channel, and the link will be sent around to everyone that registered for it. So all that remains for me now is to say thank you to everyone around the Indian Ocean and indeed all around the world who joined. And in particular, thank you to each of our speakers, David, Elisabetta, Lisa and Kath. Thank you very much for lending your expertise today. And goodbye, everyone.